Crying bear mom leads man to her dying cub. What happens next will leave you in awe. The wind howled through the dense Alaskan wilderness, a relentless force that pushed snow across the frozen ground in swirling sheets. The cabin stood alone, a solitary outpost of warmth and humanity amid the vast expanse of white. Inside, Ethan Carter sat slumped in a weathered armchair near the crackling wood stove, staring into the flames as if they might offer answers to the questions that haunted him. The small space was rustic but serviceable, the kind of place built for survival, not comfort. The walls bore the faint scent of pine sap, mingling with the acrid tang of smoke that escaped the stove's vent on occasion. Ethan's hands rested on his knees, calloused and idle, their usual precision now stilled by months of grief. 3 months ago, he'd walked away from everything: his thriving veterinary practice, his friends, and the home that once echoed with laughter. The car accident that took his wife Claire and their 6-year-old daughter Lily had left an emptiness inside him so vast that no city or career could fill it. So he had retreated here, to the edge of the Alaskan wilderness, hoping that nature's brutal honesty might help him make sense of a world where senseless things happen. But if the silence of the wilderness had taught him anything, it was that it didn't care about his pain. The mountains stood indifferent, the rivers roared without pause, and the snow fell as it always had, covering everything without discrimination. Ethan reached for the mug of black coffee that sat cooling on the small table beside him. The ceramic surface was chipped, and the coffee had long since gone lukewarm, but he sipped it anyway, wincing at the bitterness. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the windows and causing the lantern hanging near the door to sway slightly. He wondered, not for the first time, if his escape to this remote cabin was a mistake. Every night, sleep evaded him, and every day the routine of chopping firewood, setting traps, and foraging for provisions felt like a futile gesture against the emptiness in his chest. On the table near the coffee sat a photo of his family, its edges worn from being handled too often. Claire's dark curls framed her bright smile, while Lily's gap-toothed grin was frozen in mid-laughter, a moment of joy captured just weeks before the accident. Ethan picked up the frame and studied it, as he had done countless times, searching their faces for some reassurance, some direction. But tonight, like every other night, they offered none. With a sigh, he set it back down and leaned his head against the chair's backrest, his eyes drifting closed. For a while, the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic howling of the wind were his only companions. His dreams, when they came, were vivid and merciless. He was back in San Diego, standing in his clinic, where the air smelled of antiseptic and the soft murmur of animals in recovery filled the space. Claire was there, leaning against the doorway with Lily perched on her hip. They were laughing at something he'd said, a sound so warm and real that it broke his heart anew. Then came the screech of tires, the shattering of glass, and the weight of inevitability. Ethan woke with a start, the echo of their laughter still ringing in his ears, quickly replaced by the roar of the storm outside. He sat upright, his chest heaving, and ran a trembling hand through his short-cropped hair. The fire had dimmed, casting long shadows that flickered ominously against the log walls. He tossed another log onto the embers, watching as the flames hesitated, then flared to life. Unable to stay still, Ethan grabbed his coat and boots, deciding to step outside despite the storm. The bitter cold slapped him in the face as he opened the door, snow whipping through the air and stinging his cheeks. He pulled his hood tight and stepped onto the porch, squinting into the darkness. The forest loomed in the distance, its silhouettes blurred by the falling snow. In the city, he might have turned to colleagues, a therapist, or even a stranger at a bar for solace. Here, he had only the mountains and the stars, though even they were hidden tonight. Ethan's gaze fell to the snow-covered ground, where his own tracks from earlier in the day had already been erased by the storm. The sight unsettled him more than it should have, a reminder of how easily things could disappear, leaving no trace behind. He leaned against the porch railing, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and let his mind drift. Claire had always been the optimist, the one who believed in the restorative power of time and love. But now that both had been stripped from him, Ethan found it impossible to share her faith. As he stood there, lost in thought, a faint sound broke through the wind's relentless howl. At first, he thought he had imagined it, a distant, mournful cry that seemed to rise and fall with the gusts. He held his breath, straining to listen. There it was again, unmistakably real. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the call of an owl. It was something alive, something in pain. Adrenaline surged through him as his instincts sharpened, the part of him that had saved countless lives during his career snapping into focus. Ethan grabbed a flashlight from the hook near the door and stepped off the porch, the snow crunching under his boots as he moved toward the sound. The cry grew louder as he trudged through the drifts, his flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. His heart pounded, though whether from exertion or anticipation, he couldn't tell. After several minutes, he spotted movement near the edge of the forest, a dark shape partially obscured by the falling snow. He approached cautiously, his breath visible in the cold air, and as the shape came into focus, he froze. A grizzly bear stood just a few yards away, its massive form outlined against the trees. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears, his mind racing through every piece of advice he'd ever given to hikers and campers about bear encounters. Then he noticed something that made his fear fade, replaced by curiosity and concern. The bear wasn't looking at him, it was looking at the ground beside it. Following its gaze, Ethan saw a smaller shape, motionless and partially buried in the snow. It was a bear cub, its paw twisted unnaturally and its small body trembling with exhaustion. The mother bear let out a low, guttural sound, glancing between Ethan and her cub. In that instant, something passed between them, a silent understanding that transcended fear or instinct. Ethan raised his hand slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm here to help." The mother bear stepped back slightly, her massive frame still tense but no longer threatening. Ethan approached the cub cautiously, his heart aching at the sight of its injury. Its fur was matted with blood near the paw, and its breathing was shallow. Kneeling in the snow, Ethan reached out with practiced hands, his touch gentle as he examined the wound. The cub whimpered softly, its eyes half-lidded with pain. "You're going to be okay," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the cub or himself. The mother bear watched intently as Ethan carefully lifted the cub into his arms, its small body surprisingly light. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a spark of purpose, a reason to act, to care. Without another word, he turned and began the slow trek back to the cabin, the mother bear following at a distance, her trust implicit in every step. The cabin door creaked on its hinges as Ethan pushed it open, the weight of the injured cub in his arms causing him to move with care. The warmth from the wood stove spilled out into the icy night, and he stepped inside quickly, closing the door against the storm and the unseen presence of the mother bear, lingering in the shadows of the forest. His breath came in sharp bursts, misting in the cold air before fading into the cabin's comforting heat. He glanced through the frost-coated window, his eyes searching for the massive silhouette of the mother bear. For a fleeting moment, her dark shape loomed at the edge of the trees, her eyes catching the faint glow from the cabin. Then she turned and disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving Ethan alone with her cub. The cub let out a faint whimper, bringing his focus back to the immediate crisis. Its small body shivered uncontrollably, the thin fur on its belly no match for the brutal Alaskan winter. Ethan crossed the room quickly, laying the cub down on a thick blanket he spread near the fire. The cabin, though small, felt cavernous as he moved from one side to the other, gathering supplies, gauze, antiseptic, scissors, and a bowl of warm water. These tools, remnants of the life he'd left behind, had remained untouched since his arrival, tucked away in a storage bin that had once belonged to his clinic. He hadn't thought he'd need them here. Not like this. Ethan knelt beside the cub, his movements deliberate and precise, honed by years of treating creatures far more unpredictable and dangerous than this. The cub's paw was twisted at an unnatural angle, the fur around the wound matted with dried blood and dirt. Ethan winced at the sight, murmuring softly as he worked. "You're a tough little guy, aren't you?" he said, his voice low and even. The cub blinked up at him, its dark eyes filled with pain and fear. Gently, Ethan used a pair of scissors to trim the fur around the wound, exposing the torn flesh beneath. The cub whimpered again, its small body jerking in protest, but Ethan kept his hands steady, speaking in a soothing tone. "It's okay, I know it hurts, but I have to clean this up first." Dipping a cloth into the warm water, he began to clean the wound, careful not to press too hard. The cub let out a soft cry, and Ethan paused, his throat tightening at the sound. He reached out instinctively, placing a calming hand on the cub's head. Its fur was damp and coarse beneath his fingers, and for a moment he thought of Lily's favorite stuffed bear, worn soft from years of bedtime hugs. The memory hit him with unexpected force, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the living, breathing creature before him. "Almost done," he whispered. Once the wound was clean, Ethan inspected the paw more closely. The injury was severe but not catastrophic. A fracture, likely from a fall or a sharp twist. He reached for the splinting materials, fashioning a makeshift brace from a sturdy piece of cardboard and medical tape. His fingers worked methodically, wrapping the paw with practiced precision, even as his mind wandered. He thought of the mother bear waiting out there in the storm, her primal instincts overridden by the trust she had placed in him. That trust felt like both a gift and a burden, one that demanded something of him he hadn't yet fully considered. As he finished securing the brace, Ethan sat back on his heels, studying the cub. Its breathing had slowed, and though its eyes remained half open, there was a flicker of relief in their dark depths. "That's better," he said softly, running a hand over the cub's side. Its fur was coarse and wild, its body fragile in a way that made him ache with both empathy and resolve. He reached for a clean blanket and draped it gently over the cub, tucking it in as if it were a child. The small creature sighed, its tiny body relaxing against the warmth of the fire. Ethan stayed there for a while, his legs crossed and his elbows resting on his knees, watching the flames dance in the hearth. The cabin, once a place of suffocating solitude, felt different now, as though the presence of the cub had nudged something loose inside him. He thought about the clinic he'd left behind, the countless animals he'd saved over the years, and the faces of families filled with gratitude. He had walked away from all of that, convinced it no longer mattered, that nothing could matter in the absence of Claire and Lily. But now, with the injured cub resting peacefully in his care, he felt the faintest stirrings of a purpose he had long since abandoned. The hours passed in a blur of quiet vigilance. Ethan stoked the fire, kept the cub's bandages dry, and even managed to coax it into drinking a small amount of water from a shallow dish. Outside, the storm began to wane, the relentless howl of the wind softening into a low murmur. The first light of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows, casting a pale glow across the cabin's interior. Ethan rose stiffly from his spot by the fire, his muscles protesting after a night spent on the floor. He stretched and moved to the window, peering out at the snow-covered landscape. The trees were heavy with ice, their branches glinting in the morning light, and the world beyond the cabin seemed impossibly still. Ethan's eyes scanned the forest edge, searching for any sign of the mother bear. He knew she was out there, watching, waiting. The thought filled him with a strange mix of awe and responsibility. He didn't know what had compelled her to trust him, to bring her cub so close to a human. Perhaps she had no other choice. Perhaps instinct had driven her, the same instinct that now stirred in Ethan, pulling him towards something he hadn't yet fully understood. He turned back to the cub, which was still curled beneath the blanket, its small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Ethan crouched beside it, brushing his hand lightly over its head. "We'll get you back to your mom soon," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure how or when. He only knew he couldn't fail now, not when so much had already been placed in his hands. As the morning sun climbed higher, spilling light across the snow, Ethan felt a quiet determination settle over him. He had been running from the world, from himself for too long. This cub, this fragile, innocent life, had reminded him of something he thought he had lost forever, the power to make a difference. For the first time in months, Ethan allowed himself a small, tentative smile. There was work to do, challenges to face, and a long road ahead. But for now, he was exactly where he needed to be. The morning stretched into a pale, crystalline silence, the kind of calm that only followed a storm's fury. Ethan stood at the cabin window, his breath fogging the glass as he looked out at the vast wilderness blanketed in untouched snow. The forest seemed endless, its pine trees heavy with ice and frost, their boughs bowing slightly under the weight. Somewhere within that frozen expanse, the mother bear was waiting. He didn't know how far she had gone or whether she would return, but he felt her presence like a weight against his chest, a silent tether connecting them through her injured cub, now nestled by the fire. The cub stirred faintly under the blanket, letting out a soft whimper that drew Ethan's attention. He knelt beside it, carefully lifting the edge of the blanket to check the makeshift splint. The paw was swollen but no longer bleeding, a good sign that the worst of the injury had been stabilized. Ethan ran his hand lightly over the cub's side, feeling the rise and fall of its breath, steady but shallow. "You're stronger than you look," he murmured, his voice carrying a faint note of admiration. The cub opened one eye, then the other, watching him with a mixture of exhaustion and wary trust. Ethan's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "Your mom will be proud of you," he said, though the words felt heavier than he intended. The phrase lodged in his chest, dredging up memories he wasn't ready to face, but he forced himself to push past them. Ethan stood and moved to the small kitchen, lighting the propane stove with a practiced flick of his wrist. The kettle began to hum softly as he filled a bowl with water and set it nearby, glancing back at the cub every so often. As the water heated, he debated his next steps. He couldn't keep the cub inside indefinitely, but it was far too vulnerable to survive on its own. The mother bear might still be nearby, but leaving the cub out in the open could invite predators or further injury. He poured the hot water into the bowl, swirling it with his fingers to cool it, and then returned to the fire. Kneeling, he offered the water to the cub, tilting the bowl slightly to make it easier to lap at. The cub hesitated, its nose twitching as it sniffed the bowl, then dipped its tongue tentatively into the warm liquid. Ethan felt an unexpected surge of relief watching it drink, the simple act affirming the small creature's will to survive. The day passed slowly, the cabin filled with the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional sound of the cub shifting on its blanket. Outside, the snow began to sparkle under the weak winter sun, and Ethan decided it was time to venture out. He donned his thick coat, boots, and gloves, then pulled a hat over his head. "I'll be back," he said softly, glancing at the cub as if it might understand. The cub's dark eyes followed him, but it made no sound, its small body curling tighter beneath the blanket. Ethan stepped outside, the cold biting at his face despite the layers of clothing. The air was crisp and sharp, filling his lungs with an ache that felt oddly cleansing. He scanned the tree line, his boots crunching through the fresh snow as he ventured a few steps away from the cabin. Tracks. They were faint but unmistakable. A wide, heavy gate with deep impressions where claws had sunk into the snow. The mother bear had passed this way, circling the cabin before retreating toward the forest. Ethan crouched near the tracks, running his fingers lightly over the edges of the prints. They were fresh, likely made just before dawn. He straightened, his gaze following the trail as it disappeared into the dense undergrowth. For a moment he considered following it, but the thought of leaving the cub alone, even briefly, tugged at his mind. He turned back toward the cabin, his breath coming in slow, visible puffs as he replayed the morning's events in his mind. Back inside, the cub was dozing, its small body rising and falling rhythmically. Ethan shrugged off his coat and boots, setting them near the door before settling back down by the fire. He leaned against the edge of the sofa, staring into the flames as his thoughts wandered. The stillness of the cabin was no longer oppressive, but oddly comforting, filled with the quiet presence of the cub. He thought about the mother bear out there in the cold, her instincts pulling her towards survival while her trust had tethered her to this human. He marveled at the raw simplicity of it, how animals, unlike people, seemed to understand the balance of trust and risk so innately. His gaze drifted to the bookshelf near the far wall, cluttered with a mix of field guides, old journals, and photographs. One photo in particular caught his eye. It was an old picture of himself, Claire, and Lily standing in front of a large glass enclosure at the zoo. Behind them, a tiger lay sprawled lazily in the shade, its stripes vivid even through the smudged glass. Ethan remembered the day vividly. Lily had insisted on seeing every single animal, her enthusiasm boundless as she dragged him from exhibit to exhibit. Claire had laughed, snapping photos as Lily peppered him with questions about the animals' diets, habitats, and quirks. His heart ached at the memory, but he didn't turn away from it. Instead, he allowed himself to feel it, the pain sharp but cleansing, like a winter wind cutting through heavy air. The cub stirred again, its small whimper pulling Ethan from his thoughts. He moved toward it, crouching beside the blanket. "Hey, little guy," he said softly, reaching out to stroke its fur. The cub's eyes fluttered open, and it let out a soft, tentative sound that Ethan recognized as both a question and a plea. "You're going to be okay," he said firmly, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out." He adjusted the blanket around the cub, tucking it in snugly before rising to his feet. As the afternoon light began to fade, Ethan found himself glancing out the window more often, his thoughts drifting to the mother bear. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still nearby, watching and waiting. The bond between them, however fragile, felt tangible in a way that defied explanation. He decided he would leave some food at the edge of the forest, something to let her know he hadn't forgotten her, that he understood the unspoken agreement between them. He prepared a small bundle of food, wrapping it in cloth before stepping out into the cold again. The forest loomed in front of him, its shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Ethan walked carefully, placing the bundle on a large flat rock just beyond the tree line. He stood there for a moment, his breath hanging in the air, before retreating to the cabin. As he closed the door behind him, the cub let out a soft sound, as if welcoming him back. Ethan knelt beside it, his hand resting lightly on its side. "We're in this together," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet determination. The fire crackled softly, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt a faint spark of purpose reigniting within him. The pale morning light crept through the frost-laden windows of the cabin, casting faint shadows that danced across the wooden floor. Ethan stirred awake in his chair near the fire, his neck stiff from a night spent half sleeping and keeping an eye on the cub nestled under its blanket. The fire had burned low, reduced to glowing embers, but the small room retained its warmth, a cocoon against the biting cold outside. Ethan rubbed his eyes and sat up, his gaze immediately landing on the cub. It was still curled tightly, but its breathing had grown. As the afternoon light began to fade, Ethan found himself glancing out the window more often, his thoughts drifting to the mother bear. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still nearby, watching and waiting. The bond between them, however fragile, felt tangible in a way that defied explanation. He decided he would leave some food at the edge of the forest, something to let her know he hadn't forgotten her, that he understood the unspoken agreement between them. He prepared a small bundle of food, wrapping it in cloth before stepping out into the cold again. The forest loomed in front of him, its shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Ethan walked carefully, placing the bundle on a large flat rock just beyond the tree line. He stood there for a moment, his breath hanging in the air, before retreating to the cabin. As he closed the door behind him, the cub let out a soft sound, as if welcoming him back. Ethan knelt beside it, his hand resting lightly on its side. "We're in this together," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet determination. The fire crackled softly, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt a faint spark of purpose reigniting within him. The pale morning light crept through the frost-laden windows of the cabin, casting faint shadows that danced across the wooden floor. Ethan stirred awake in his chair near the fire, his neck stiff from a night spent half sleeping and keeping an eye on the cub nestled under its blanket. The fire had burned low, reduced to glowing embers, but the small room retained its warmth, a cocoon against the biting cold outside. Ethan rubbed his eyes and sat up, his gaze immediately landing on the cub. It was still curled tightly, but its breathing had grown. Approached, her dark eyes locking onto him with an intensity that froze him in place. Ethan raised his hands slowly, his heart pounding as he tried to project calm. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady. "Your cub is safe." The bear didn't move, her body tense and her breath visible in short, measured bursts. Ethan crouched slightly, trying to make himself appear less threatening. "I'm going to bring the cub back," he continued, speaking as if she could understand. "Just give me a little more time." The bear huffed, a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl but still sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. She took a step forward, her massive paws crunching through the snow, then stopped, her gaze flicking past him as though searching for her cub. Ethan stood his ground, his instincts screaming at him to retreat, but he forced himself to remain still. "I'll take care of it," he said firmly. After a long moment, the bear seemed to accept his presence, turning and retreating deeper into the forest. Ethan let out a slow breath, his muscles finally unclenching. He had bought himself more time, but the unspoken agreement felt fragile, as though it could shatter with the slightest misstep. Back at the cabin, the cub greeted him with a soft yip, its ears perking up as he entered. Ethan smiled despite himself, shaking the snow from his boots before kneeling beside the blanket. "She's waiting for you," he said quietly, brushing a hand over the cub's head. The thought of reuniting them filled him with equal parts hope and trepidation. The cub wasn't fully healed, but keeping it separated from its mother for too long would only create more problems. He needed a plan. Ethan spent the rest of the day preparing. He fashioned a crude but sturdy sled from some spare wood he found in the storage shed, lashing the pieces together with rope and testing its weight-bearing ability. The cub watched him work, its head tilting curiously every so often. By the time the sled was finished, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. Ethan fed the cub a small bowl of warmed broth, watching as it drank eagerly. "Tomorrow," he said softly. "We'll try tomorrow." That night, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Ethan lay awake on the sofa, his thoughts racing. The cub had drifted off to sleep, its small body curled tightly under the blanket, but Ethan's mind refused to settle. He thought about the mother bear, waiting in the cold, and about the fragile trust that had formed between them. It was a trust he couldn't afford to break, not for her sake, not for the cub's, and not for his own. As he stared at the ceiling, the faint echo of Lily's laughter surfaced in his memory, intertwining with the soft sounds of the wilderness outside. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something stir deep within him, a sense of purpose that burned quietly but steadily, like the embers of the fire. Tomorrow he would act. The morning broke with a brittle clarity, the kind that made every breath feel sharp and alive in the cold. Ethan woke before the sun crested the horizon, his mind already set on the task ahead. The cub was still sleeping near the fire, its small body rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm under the blanket. Ethan lingered for a moment, crouching beside it to check the splint one last time, his hands careful and deliberate. The paw was still swollen but showed no signs of infection, and though the cub whimpered softly when touched, its strength was returning. That small progress gave Ethan a sliver of hope as he moved to prepare for the day. The sled he had built leaned against the wall near the door, its rough construction sturdy enough to bear the weight of the cub. He had tested its balance the night before, adjusting the rope harness and smoothing out the edges to prevent splinters. Now he draped a thick blanket across the sled's surface, layering it with straw for added insulation. The weather outside was unforgiving, and the cub would need every ounce of warmth to survive the journey. Ethan grabbed his pack and filled it with essentials: a flask of warm broth, a first aid kit, and a small pouch of dried berries he hoped might serve as an offering to the mother bear. He pulled on his coat, gloves, and boots, then checked his gear one final time before turning back to the cub. "All right, little one," he said softly, his breath forming faint clouds in the chilly air of the cabin. "It's time to get you home." The cub opened its dark eyes, blinking groggily before letting out a faint yip. Ethan lifted it gently, cradling its fragile body in his arms as he carried it to the sled. It whimpered once but settled quickly as he tucked it into the blanket and secured it in place with a few loops of rope. "There we go," he murmured, crouching beside the sled and running a hand over the cub's head. "Safe and snug." Outside, the morning was silent except for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. The snow stretched out in an unbroken expanse, glistening in the pale light of dawn. Ethan took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and grasped the sled's rope. The first few steps were heavy, the sled dragging against the packed snow. But once he found his rhythm, the weight felt manageable. The forest loomed ahead, its shadows deepening as he left the clearing around the cabin and ventured into the trees. Ethan followed the path he'd scouted the day before, the faint impressions of the mother bear's tracks still visible in places where the wind hadn't erased them. He moved steadily, his boots crunching through the snow and the sled gliding behind him. The cub stirred occasionally, letting out soft sounds that Ethan interpreted as a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Each time, he paused to check the blankets and ensure the cub was warm. "We're almost there," he reassured it, though he wasn't entirely sure how far they had to go. The tracks meandered deeper into the forest, weaving between dense clusters of pines that towered overhead, their branches heavy with snow. The journey was slow and methodical, each step requiring focus as the terrain grew uneven. Ethan's breath came in steady puffs, his body warming under the exertion. The air was filled with the faint sense of pine and frost, the kind of crisp, clean cold that seemed to amplify every sound. A bird called out somewhere in the distance, its cry sharp and piercing against the quiet. Ethan kept his eyes forward, scanning for signs of movement. He knew the mother bear was close. He could feel it, a presence just beyond his line of sight, watching. After an hour of steady progress, he reached a small clearing where the tracks circled and converged. Ethan stopped, setting the sled down carefully and stepping forward to inspect the area. The snow here was disturbed, flattened by the bear's heavy movements. He crouched low, running his gloved fingers over the impressions, noting how recently they'd been made. His heart quickened. She was nearby. He turned back to the sled where the cub lay watching him, its dark eyes reflecting a glimmer of trust. "This is it," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with anticipation. He unfastened the cub from the sled, lifting it into his arms with care. It whimpered softly, its small body shivering despite the blanket wrapped around it. Ethan stood in the center of the clearing, his breath visible in the cold air, and waited. The forest around him felt impossibly still, the kind of silence that carried weight and expectation. He glanced at the trees, searching for any sign of movement, his muscles taut with both caution and hope. Then from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, she appeared. The mother bear emerged slowly, her massive frame moving with a deliberate grace that belied her size. Ethan's breath caught as he took in the sight of her, the sheer power and presence she exuded. Her dark eyes locked onto him immediately, assessing the situation with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. She stopped several yards away, her body tense but poised, ready to act if needed. Ethan held his ground, his heart pounding as he carefully knelt and placed the cub on the snow between them. The mother bear let out a low rumble, a sound that was neither a threat nor an invitation. Ethan stayed still, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steady. "I'm just here to help." The cub let out a weak cry, its small body trembling as it tried to stand. The mother bear took a step forward, her massive paws crunching through the snow. Ethan remained motionless, watching as she closed the distance, her gaze never leaving him. The moment stretched, every second feeling like an eternity as the mother bear reached her cub. She sniffed it carefully, her massive head lowering as she nudged it gently with her nose. The cub responded with a soft whimper, pressing against her leg for warmth and reassurance. Ethan exhaled slowly, relief washing over him as he witnessed the reunion. The mother bear turned her gaze to him one last time, a look that carried an unspoken gratitude and a warning not to follow. Then with her cub nestled against her side, she turned and retreated into the forest, her form disappearing into the shadows. Ethan remained kneeling in the snow long after they were gone, his chest heaving with a mixture of exhaustion and emotion. The clearing felt emptier without them, but he couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted within him. He had done what he came to do, and though the bears were gone, the connection he had felt to them lingered, like an ember glowing faintly in the cold. Standing slowly, Ethan dusted the snow from his knees and turned back toward the sled. The journey back to the cabin would be long and silent, but for the first time in months, he felt a sense of purpose that didn't weigh him down. Instead, it carried him forward, steady and strong, like the rhythm of his steps in the snow. The cabin door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, shaking off the cold that clung to his coat and boots. The fire had burned low in his absence, leaving the room dim and quiet. but the warmth still lingered faintly in the air. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the crisp evening chill and the vast expanse of wilderness that had borne witness to the day's events. For a long moment, he stood there in the stillness, his hands resting on the back of a chair as he stared into the faint glow of the embers. He could still feel the weight of the sled rope in his hand, the tension in his muscles from dragging it across the snow, and the raw, awe-inspiring presence of the mother bear as she reclaimed her cub. The memory hung in his mind like the final note of a song, resonating long after the sound had faded. Ethan moved to the fire, crouching down to stoke the embers and add a few logs. The flames leapt to life, casting flickering shadows across the walls and bathing the room in a golden warmth. As he fed the fire, he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything the past few days had brought to the surface. The bears were gone, retreating into the safety of the wilderness, but their presence lingered in the quiet corners of the cabin, in the faint impressions left by the cub's small form on the blanket by the hearth, and in the shift he felt within himself. It was as if they had carried away a part of his grief, leaving behind a hollow space where something new was beginning to grow. He stood and crossed to the table, his gaze falling on the photograph that had been his companion through months of isolation. Claire's smile shone as brightly as ever, frozen in time beside Lily's gap-toothed grin. Ethan traced the edge of the frame with his thumb, his chest tightening with a familiar ache that was no longer unbearable, just bittersweet. He set the photo down and leaned against the table, staring out the frost-covered window at the darkening forest beyond. For the first time since the accident, he felt a flicker of clarity, a sense that his path, though uncertain, was beginning to unfold. The evening passed in a haze of quiet reflection. Ethan ate a simple meal of soup and bread, the warmth of the food grounding him as he replayed the events of the day. He thought of the mother bear's eyes as they had met his, filled with something that wasn't quite human, yet carried an undeniable depth. Trust, recognition, gratitude. He thought of the cub's fragile body and the way it had clung to life despite the odds. And he thought of his own hands that had once healed countless animals, but had felt useless in the face of his own loss. They didn't feel useless anymore. As the hours stretched on, the fire burned steadily, its light flickering against the walls. Ethan sat in the armchair, a notebook open on his lap, its blank pages staring back at him. He had avoided writing for months, unable to find the words to express what churned inside him. But now the silence felt different, less oppressive, more like an invitation. He picked up a pen and began to write, the words coming slowly at first, then flowing with a quiet urgency. He wrote about the bears, about the fragility and resilience he had witnessed, and about the connection he had felt in the stillness of the forest. He wrote about Claire and Lily, their laughter and love, and the hole they had left in his heart. But he also wrote about the faint glimmers of hope he hadn't expected to find. Hope that had emerged not in grand moments, but in the quiet persistence of life. By the time he set the pen down, the notebook was filled with scattered thoughts and half-formed ideas, but it felt like a beginning. He closed it gently and placed it on the table, his hands lingering on the cover as if to anchor himself to the act of moving forward. The fire crackled softly and Ethan leaned back in the chair, letting his eyes drift close. Sleep came easily for the first time in what felt like forever, wrapping him in a warmth that wasn't just physical, but deeply, profoundly human. The next morning, Ethan woke to sunlight streaming through the window, the snow outside glittering like a field of diamonds. The storm had passed, leaving the world pristine and still. He rose slowly, stretching as he moved to the window. The forest stretched out before him, vast and unknowable, yet no longer intimidating. It felt alive in a way he hadn't noticed before, as if every tree and shadow held a secret waiting to be discovered. Ethan stood, there for a long time, watching the sunlight filter through the branches, before turning to the room with a sense of quiet resolve. He spent the day tidying the cabin, packing away the medical supplies he had used for the cub, and reorganizing the small living space. It was a mundane task, but it carried a sense of purpose that steadied him. As he worked, he thought about what came next. The cabin had been a sanctuary, a place to grieve and heal, but he knew now it wasn't meant to be permanent. The bears had reminded him of the world beyond these walls, a world that needed people who cared, who acted, who didn't give up. He thought of Claire and Lily, their love for animals, their endless curiosity about the natural world, and he felt a quiet certainty that he could honor them by carrying that love forward. By mid-afternoon, Ethan found himself standing by the door, his coat and boots on, a pack slung over one shoulder. The cabin was warm and inviting behind him, but his gaze was fixed on the forest, where the mother bear and her cub had disappeared. He didn't know where they were now, but the thought of them thriving out there, together, filled him with a sense of peace. He stepped outside, the cold biting at his cheeks, and began walking toward the tree line. His steps were measured but confident, each one a small act of defiance against the doubts that had once paralyzed him. As he reached the edge of the forest, he paused, turning back to look at the cabin. It stood strong and unyielding against the snow, a testament to his survival and a reminder of the path he had traveled. Ethan smiled faintly, then turned back to the forest, his breath visible in the crisp air. He didn't know exactly where the trail would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to follow it. The wilderness stretched out before him, vast and full of possibility. And Ethan took his first step into the unknown, carrying with him the memory of what he had lost and the hope of what he might yet find.